Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 176. When intimacy and priorities don't line up. Oh no, they're not lined up. What are we going to do? So I was looking at my to-do list the other day. I usually make a to-do list of all like the mundane things that I need to do. And I usually have a scheduled time later on in the day where I'm like, okay, at this time, this is when I'm going to tackle these things that just need to get done. They're not the fun things. They're not necessarily the exciting things, but things that need to be taken care of nonetheless. And as I was looking at it, I just had that one moment of awareness where I was like, man, if I look at what is on this to-do list, it's just a bunch of stuff, right? It's just the tasks. And what I noticed was that there is something missing also on that to-do list that I made. And that was relationships, right? Like there was nothing on there about, hey, make sure you reconnect with your 10-year-old today, or make sure that, perhaps you send a text to your daughter and say something super nice about how proud you are of her. Or, hey, take a closer look at something that has to do with your own relationship with sex and intimacy and look at it. Take a look at it. And I realized that a lot of times, either as husbands or wives, we can make these to-do lists and feel very good about what we are accomplishing, right? Checking off the box. Like that can feel so amazing. And we can get a lot done that way. But it also invites us, and maybe we can use this opportunity to say, hey, have I put the bigger stones in the jar? Or am I just looking at all the little grains of sand and making sure that those things get taken care of, that so much so that there is no room for those bigger things that really matter, that give us mental health, emotional health, those strong connections and relationships. And so I'm wondering if we can like reinvent the to-do list a little bit and say, hey, maybe at the top of my to-do list, I'm going to put something in that I've never put on the list before. And we'll talk about that at the end of this episode. But I also wanted to share another story. I was just at the doctor's the other day, and right now I'm 48. I'm almost 49. And so we were just talking about the female body and just changes that I can expect to come soon, especially menopause. And we were talking a little bit about that. And she brought up a complaint that she gets all the time. And so she was talking to me about it. And she said, so many of the people that come to me, the women who are starting to go through menopause or have gone through it, they've gained weight, right? Because the body starts to change the processes, the processing, and how it actually functions and works. And she said, so women come in frustrated, like, hey, I've gained 10 pounds. I've gained 20 pounds and I'm a healthy eater. Like I haven't done anything different. I'm still eating good. Like, why am I gaining this weight? And she said, the problem is you haven't done anything different. Right? Just like they're saying, I haven't done anything different. It's not like I'm eating Ben and Jerry's every night, right? Like they haven't done anything that would necessarily be negative to make them gain weight, but they haven't also done and put in to what they're doing something positive that will counteract, or whatever that word is, that will go in the opposite direction of some of the processing that needs to be addressing now that those things are changing. So she's like, that's right. You're not doing anything different, and you need to do something different. What you've been doing the last 20 years is no longer going to be enough if you want to maintain your weight. You will have to do something different. And I was like, oh, I really appreciate this line of thinking, that sometimes we get really stuck in the way that we're doing things, and we hope that things will get better, even if we don't do anything different. And then when things don't improve, we get really frustrated and we wonder why things aren't improving. And it's probably going to be because we need to do something different. So I wanted to talk about our priorities and where our priorities are at in life, especially when it comes to a husband and a wife, because a lot of times we are like, well, family is priority, but that's so vague. And how a husband may approach the priority of family may be completely opposite of how the wife approaches the priority of family. And so I wanted to bring up some of the challenges that I see when couples come to me, especially when it comes to priorities and intimacy and how they think and view these things. So often when a wife comes to me and she is struggling, not with maybe like the whole marriage, or maybe most things in the marriage are going pretty well, but sex really seems to be a struggle. The wife will often think that sex is the number one priority for her husband. That is a thought that she thinks, and she will be very convinced of it, right? She will convince herself that this is his number one priority. He may have said comments in the past, maybe out of frustration, but usually it's the brain making assumptions that this is the number one priority for all men everywhere in the world. And since sex is not her number one priority, it's almost as if her brain is like, I think we're going to need to resist sex, right? Because it is my husband's priority, and that's not my priority. I am far above the animalistic priority of sex. And so the brain almost subconsciously and probably subconsciously resists the entire concept of sex. And sometimes the wife will do this in fear, right? Because heaven forbid if she actually pays attention to sex and says, hey, maybe I do need to spend some time with myself and discover what my relationship is with sex. The brain gets very dramatic and says, uh-oh, if you do that, you're going to go sex nuts. And it's already a priority for your husband. And heaven forbid, if that becomes your priority, then everything on that to-do list will now be erased. And none of those things will ever, ever, ever get done. Right? Like our brains do this. And so what ends up happening is that she will make it a priority to not be interested in sex. And she will feel very good about that priority because she is managing the family. She is making sure all the things on the list get done because her husband just won't be able to because all he can think about is sex. So she will end up holding back maybe her own desire to discover more about that part of herself, or maybe if she doesn't even have that desire, she will resist challenging herself to say, hey, I need to take a closer look at this because this is part of my makeup, part of how I'm created, and I have been neglecting it. And maybe there would be some benefit to actually spending a little bit of time focusing on sex and intimacy and my relationship with it. And she ends up resisting that notion to counteract the fact in her mind that that's the only thing her husband is interested in. So I want to point out here that this is just brain work. Like this is what our brain does on autopilot. It gives us these thoughts. We latch onto them, whether or not we chose to. We often just latch onto thoughts that our brain gives us. And we have a lot of drama about it. Our brain will often think in extremes, in polar opposites, in black and white. And we have to purposely intervene with our own brain. And if we don't know to do that, then our brain is just going to run amok on autopilot, and it will throw these major defiant temper tantrums, just like 2 and 3-year-olds do when they don't get what they want or in order to get what they want. And so a wife can find herself doing this without even intentionally meaning to do it. Now, if we look at what the husband might be doing, a lot of times the husband will come maybe to a coaching session with his wife because he is frustrated with how their sex life is going. And one of the things that he will be frustrated by is that he really believes that his wife has zero interest in sex. Like it is not a priority at all. Like it really is zero. It doesn't even make it to her to-do list on purpose. And so a lot of times the husband can see his wife's to-do list and he's like, where do I fit in? Right? Where is us in all of this? Right? He can see all the things about the house or the kids or pets or whatever it is. And so he will start to have lots of thoughts about that as well, that will just be run on autopilot by his brain. So some of the things that he might think and assume is that, you know what, my wife really does not have any interest in sex, zero. And she also makes zero effort to learn about this side of herself or this part of our relationship. It's not the only part of our relationship, but it's also not insignificant, like as if it counts for zero. Especially if you're raised with high morals and high values, right? You're usually taught abstinence, and then that marriage is the place to have a sexual relationship. And so a lot of times the husband's going to be like, I got the wrong wife model. We're supposed to be having sex in marriage. And now it seems like that's not even happening at all. And so he worries and assumes that sex will never make it to her to-do list, ever, for their entire life and their entire marriage. So if you guys have been married for 6 years, he's envisioning the next 60 that sex will never make it to the to-do list. And so this also creates a lot of mind drama for the husband, because he will have his own fears about what that means. And he will start to think, hey, if I don't pursue it, if I don't seek after it, if I don't initiate it, man, we will never, ever, ever have it. Right? So he is functioning from his own set of fears, just like the wife is functioning from her set of fears. And this will also create a scarcity mentality for him when it comes to sex. Like, we will never have it. There will never be enough, right? There's no cap on sex. There's not like a limit, like, oh, if you had sex once this year, then you can just never have it again. There's no cap on it. But the brain will think that there's a cap and that the cap has already been established and that it's very low. And so he also is having a lot of brain drama, a lot of thinking in extremes. And there's an interesting one here that I really want to bring up, is that oftentimes when couples come to me, what they don't understand, and what is usually a big aha moment, is that a husband's arousal and his desire for sex is very easy. It is ingrained into his biological makeup, right? His desire for sex, his arousal system is very simple and uncomplicated. There are no prerequisites for a man's arousal. It's called spontaneous arousal, which means anything and everything could get him in the mood for sex. It's not specific. There doesn't have to be a certain number of things. It doesn't have to be a specific things. It literally could be the wind. And men often think, and husbands think, their wife functions the same. And so they're very confused that their wife is not as easily aroused and doesn't want to have it as much as them. And while they may understand, like, oh, we've all heard those quotes, like, men are like microwaves and women are like slow cookers. Like, they just need way more time to warm up. Okay, that may be true if you're missing key information, right, about the prerequisites for women's arousal, because it's not the same as men's. And if you don't know those prerequisites, you're going to need that slow cooker to be on for a long time. And even with it on and percolating for a long time doesn't even mean that the right ingredients have been put into place, which makes everything more difficult and more frustrating for everybody. And so what we end up finding with couples is that husbands are like, why can't it be easy for my wife? Because it's easy for me. I want it to be easy for her, but there's nothing easy about female arousal, especially when you don't know the ingredients. And so we really need to take a look at this concept of easiness, and is that the goal? But I am going to give all husbands a little key insight here. If you want things really to be easier for your wife when it comes to arousal, do the things that ignite her arousal system, not your own. Ding, ding, ding. What that could be are conversations with your wife about anything other than sex. If she thinks all you want is sex and then you really want to talk about sex, you're almost going to be like fueling her fire, but not in a good way. Show her you're able to have conversations about other things. Her emotional connection to you on things outside of sex is what fuels her desire. It's the biggest contributor to her arousal. Men, if you don't know that, really pay attention. If you want things to be easier for your wife, stop complaining about conversations, because that is going to turn her on. Don't look for things that are harder. Like, that's what she wants. If you're mad that you have to have conversations with her, don't be mad that she doesn't want to have sex. That is a key ingredient, that connection that happens in a conversation. So what do we do with all this? I want to make sure that we are not basing our concepts of intimacy solely on how easy things are or the frequency of sex. Those are very shallow ways to measure if our sex life is good and if our intimacy is good. It's very shallow. And yet we haven't been taught anything different. So husbands do this and they get very worried when the number of times they're having sex isn't how they imagined it or what they want it to be. And women also really struggle with this because they know, and the world has taught them to view things by frequency, right? It's almost like we don't know any other way to judge it. But it is only one way to think about sex, is just looking at frequency. But I want to offer to everybody listening that there are way more positive and beneficial ways to start looking at sex and at intimacy with a way to measure it. So I just wanted to throw that out there to really pique and challenge your brain to say, is this the only thing I'm basing our sexual and intimate relationship on, is frequency? Man, if so, we need to expand our thinking. We're not 5-year-olds. We are adults. And that means we have way more thinking capacities available to us because our brain is able to think on such bigger terms than just very limited terms. So we really want to just move away from just frequency. And if you do want to consider frequency, I'm going to give you a way to think about it in just a second. So we really want to move away from that. But the other thing we want to increase is our brain compassion for ourselves and for our spouse. Our brain is trying to be good to us. It's trying to help us. It's trying to help us survive the wild, right? But most of us are like, we're not really living in the wild, right? We have most of our basic needs met at this point. And so our brain doesn't really know to say, hey, these needs have been met. Now let's stop focusing on those. We don't need to be so dramatic and think about just life and death scenarios, but let's use our higher brain, right? Let's talk about how we are developing as a person, as a human, as a citizen, as a spouse. And if we're going to take it to a spiritual level, how am I developing as a spouse in the way that God created me? How am I growing in the space of my marriage, in the capacity of maturing on a sexual level with my spouse? How is that going? And just have that the compassion on our brain to say, I see what you're doing, brain. You're trying so hard. Thank you. But these negative thoughts that you're giving me that are limiting me, I'm going to send those packing. And I'm going to tap into the higher part of my brain and I'm going to challenge those thoughts. And I'm going to actually think about my thinking. And I'm going to ask myself, hey, are these thoughts actually benefiting my marriage as a whole? Usually they are not. And sometimes we don't want to admit that. But if we're being transparent and real and raw and authentic, some of these thoughts, and probably most of them that we have that are negative about our spouse and sex, they're all assumptions. That means they're not true. But we keep thinking things that are not true, and this is not good for marriage. So this is going to mean that maybe we take a look at our priorities and our to-do list, and we put intimacy and improving relationships at the top of the to-do list and say, what am I doing today that will help me improve my relationships? Right? Man, that is a different way to approach a to-do list. Because maybe now if we do have to run some of these errands, we're like, hey, I'm going to take my 10-year-old with me and I'm going to have some conversations that I didn't have last week. Because I'm actually going to focus on improving that relationship during that time. What a difference. If we put intimacy at the top of our to-do list and then take a step back and say, what does this mean for me and my spouse today on a daily basis? I think for women and for the wives listening, we're going to need to do something different. Just like this doctor told me, you have to do something different. And I think since women and my clients are usually very resistant to the conversations about sex, maybe that is the one thing we do need to pay attention to the frequency of. Maybe this is what we need to do different, is start talking about sex more with our husband. I don't think we understand the relief and the lowering of the anxiety we can bring to them just by having more conversations about sex. And you might be thinking, Shelly. Yes, but every time we talk about it, he just gets turned on and then he just wants to have sex. So if I talk about sex more, that means more sex. And I'm not really into that right now. It doesn't have to mean that. It may have meant that in the past, and that may have been your experience so far, but it doesn't have to mean that. You could set the precedent, say, hey, I want to talk about sex more. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I have a lot of questions, a lot of things I still don't know about myself and my relationship to sex, but I want to talk about it more. But you have to understand, it doesn't mean that every time I talk about it, I want to have sex. Like, that's not going to be the game plan. Maybe it'll lead to that though. Right? Because guess what's happening? We're actually doing what is the basis of intimacy, which is not sex. It's making ourselves known to our spouse. This is a game changer. Think about this. The more you're able to have the tough conversations, or maybe even not the tough conversations, just conversations you've never had, even silly conversations, and say, this is what I was thinking today about sex. And some of these thoughts are messy and ugly and not fun. But this is what I was thinking. Women, if we do this, we are making ourselves known to our husband. We are doing the exact thing that we actually crave, which is conversations with our spouse to create that emotional connection. We can do that. You have permission to be a wife who initiates and starts conversations about sex all on her own. You don't have to wait around and then be like, oh, there goes my husband talking about sex again. When we actually look at the numbers of how often our husbands approach us to talk about sex, we usually find when we put a number to it, it's actually very low. But our brain is like, that's all he wants to talk about. It's usually not the case. So maybe something magical is going to happen when we start talking more frequently about it. Yes. Let's think about this. Let's let our brain absorb this. So we could do something different. We can start increasing the frequency of the conversation about sex. And maybe when we increase the frequency of sex conversations, maybe our husband is going to decrease all the scarcity mentality and the, oh no, I better initiate everything. Otherwise, it'll never happen. Maybe they're going to start to be impacted by what we're doing. Can you imagine? Oh my gosh, this is going to be such a different experience. We can share. The wives can share more of their thoughts, more of their feelings, more of themselves. And do we realize that this is like the biggest contributor to our desire for sex and our arousal system? What? Do you know that that's a key ingredient? Husbands, don't be opposed to these conversations. Welcome them. If you want it to be easy, I'm telling you, you don't need to be wondering what all the missing ingredients are. I'm telling you. Take a look at this. When we are able to share these parts of ourselves with familiarity, that is the basis of intimacy. And when women feel like they can do it and their husband's listening, they're like, oh, this is intimacy. This is magical. This is, whoa, this is kind of sexy. This is kind of sexy that we're talking about sex. And it's not easy, but I like that he's listening and that I'm sharing some stuff. So that is how we can put the concept of frequency back in, but in a way that actually benefits. Husbands, how often is your wife initiating those conversations where you're not like, I only have 1 minute to listen to you? Just one. Hurry up and get it in. Give me the complaint of the day, right? Or are you looking at conversations as like, hey, this is a turn on. This is an opportunity. I'm going to look forward to those opportunities for conversations and not look at them as something super, super negative. So this is a win for the wife to generate and create her own desire based on true intimacy. And this is a win for husbands so that you can see that that sex does cross her mind. It's not like it is absent and completely missing. So you can put your mind at ease a little bit there. So as women take this initiative for themselves, because they're going to feel better, and they will be like a trailblazer in their own marriage as they do something different. Women, you will feel different. And while it may be uncomfortable to bring up things you've never done before, it's also going to feel amazing. You can feel like uncomfortable and amazing at the same time, right? Doing something hard, but you're understanding that there's so many benefits to it. So your ability to feel a natural desire to be closer to your husband in the process or after the process of having these conversations is going to be natural. It's going to be normal. It's not going to be forced. It's not going to be a duty. There's not going to be an obligation there. It's going to feel more natural to be like, oh, I liked sharing that information. It wasn't easy, but I liked the results of it. And you will be contributing to your own desire and arousal. I want you to really think about that. If interest is hard for you to be interested in sex and intimacy, if desire is a challenge, if arousal is a challenge, start to have more conversations about sex, even the difficult parts of it. And you're going to start to really unlock certain parts of yourself that need you to unlock it, not your husband. You have to unlock it for yourself. So I hope this was valuable and helpful for you. And I hope that this week you will make the decision to do something different. And that if we're going to put frequency anywhere in the mix, it should be in the conversations that we're having about sex and intimacy, even the challenges, even if those conversations are messy and tricky. Let's get into those conversations. That's where the focus of frequency needs to be. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will join me again next week.